September 19th, 1940. A street in Warsaw. German soldiers are conducting a roundup, the kind that happens without warning and without explanation, sweeping ordinary people off sidewalks and out of doorways and into trucks, bound for prisons the Germans have only just begun to build. Roughly 2,000 men will be caught in this particular net by the end of the day. Most of them are trying, in whatever small ways are still available to them, to avoid it, to turn down a side street, to duck into a shop, to be somewhere else when the soldiers come through. One man is not. A 39-year-old Polish cavalry officer named Witold Pilecki has walked out into the middle of this roundup on purpose, carrying forged identity papers in a name that is not his own, waiting to be caught. He is not caught by accident, and he is not caught because he has failed to escape something. He has spent weeks planning exactly this. Pilecki already commands a secret resistance cell fighting the German occupation of Poland. He has access to safe houses, false papers, an entire underground network built to keep men like him hidden from exactly this kind of sweep. Every instinct that has kept him alive for the past year of underground work is telling him to do what everyone around him is doing, to turn, to disappear down a side street before the soldiers reach his block. And on this morning, he uses none of it. He stands where the soldiers can see him, and he lets them take him, because the destination the Germans are sending men like him to is a new camp the Nazis have built outside a Polish town called Auschwitz, a name the Germans have already begun writing as Auschwitz, and Witold Pilecki has volunteered to go there, not been assigned, not been tricked. Volunteered, in the plain sense of the word, to walk into one of the only places in occupied Europe that almost every other human being on the continent was trying desperately to stay out of. He would spend the next 2.5 years inside it, and when he finally escaped, it would not be the worst thing that ever happened to him because of what he chose to do that morning. That would come later, from a direction he never expected, and it would come from his own country. If a story like this deserves to be remembered, take a second and hit subscribe, because that is the entire reason this channel exists, to put names back on the people history tried to erase. To understand why a free man would choose Auschwitz, you have to understand what kind of man Witold Pilecki already was by September of 1940. He was born in 1901 into a family of Polish landed gentry, and he grew up under Russian rule, in a Poland that did not technically exist yet as an independent country on any map. He joined an underground Polish scouting movement as a boy, the kind of youth organization that occupying governments tend to ban, precisely because it teaches children that their country is real, even when the adults around them are forbidden to say so out loud. As a young man, he fought in the Polish-Soviet War, taking part in the desperate defense of Warsaw in August of 1920, that most historians credit with saving the newly reborn Polish state from Soviet conquest before it had even finished being built. He became a cavalry officer, married, had 2 children, and by the late 1930s was running a military training squadron and managing his family's ancestral estate, the kind of settled, ordinary life that gives no particular warning of what a man will do when everything is taken from him at once. When Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, Pilecki fought again, in the brutal, doomed defense that lasted barely a month before the country was carved in two between Germany and the Soviet Union, invading from opposite directions in the same September. When his superior officer ordered a retreat toward Romania, the standard escape route for Polish forces trying to regroup abroad, Pilecki refused. He and a fellow officer stayed behind in occupied Poland instead. By November of 1939, barely a month after Poland's official defeat, he had co-founded one of the country's first organized resistance movements, and within months, it had expanded from a handful of officers into a functioning underground network reaching Warsaw, Siedlce, Radom, and Lublin, an intelligence and sabotage organization operating inside a country the Nazis considered already finished. There was a second, quieter turning point in that same period, one that says as much about who Pilecki was as the Auschwitz mission itself. By the spring of 1940, the co-founder of his resistance group, a man named Jan Włodarkiewicz, had begun steering their organization in an increasingly anti-Semitic and ultra-nationalist direction. Pilecki objected. Rather than go along with it, he approached a rival underground faction led by Colonel Stefan Rowecki, one that explicitly supported Jewish rights within occupied Poland and favored sharing intelligence with the Western Allies rather than hoarding it for a narrower nationalist cause. It was this second, more principled faction that would go on to propose sending someone into Auschwitz, and some historians who have studied the surviving records believe Włodarkiewicz framed the invitation to volunteer less as an honor and more as a way of removing a man who had just publicly broken with him. Whatever the internal politics behind the offer, Pilecki accepted it anyway, on his own terms, for reasons that had nothing to do with the man who proposed it. By the summer of 1940, that resistance leadership faced a problem no one had a good answer for. Reports were reaching Warsaw about a new camp the Germans had opened outside the Polish town of Oświęcim that June, built initially to hold Polish political prisoners, resistance members, intellectuals, priests, anyone the occupation considered a threat worth removing. The reports reaching the underground were fragmentary and second-hand, smuggled out through released prisoners or guards willing to be bribed, and Polish intelligence had no reliable way to confirm what was actually happening behind that particular fence. Someone needed to get inside deliberately, organize whatever resistance was possible among the men already trapped there, and find a way to carry real information back out. It was proposed to Pilecki as a mission. He accepted it. The plan itself was almost absurdly direct for something this dangerous. Pilecki would not sneak in. He would let himself be arrested in one of the periodic street roundups the Germans were already conducting across Warsaw, using forged identity papers under the name Tomasz Serafiński, a real person's name borrowed for the cover. If the plan worked, the roundup would sweep him up along with everyone else, and Auschwitz would simply become one more prisoner's destination, indistinguishable on paper from any of the other men in that truck. It worked exactly as planned, which is its own kind of horror. On September 19, 1940, Pilecki was arrested along with roughly 2,000 other men in the roundup, held for 2 days, and then transported to Auschwitz. On arrival, he was processed and assigned a number like every other prisoner in the camp's first year, stitched onto his uniform rather than burned into his skin, since the practice of tattooing prisoners directly would not begin at Auschwitz for another year, 485-9. From that moment forward, to every guard and every camp record, Witold Pilecki did not exist. There was only prisoner 4859, one number among thousands, indistinguishable from any of the other men being worked, starved, and beaten inside the wire. What Pilecki found inside Auschwitz in the autumn of 1940 was not yet the extermination camp that name would come to mean by 1943. It was, in those early months, a brutal, deliberately lethal prison camp for Polish political prisoners, run on starvation rations, arbitrary executions, and forced labor calculated to kill men slowly rather than quickly. Men were worked past the point of collapse, building the camp's own expansion with their bare hands, beaten for infractions as small as a poorly made bed, and shot for offenses that existed mainly so that an offense would always be available whenever the guards wanted one. It was a place built to erode a man's sense that he was still a person at all, long before it became the machinery of mass murder it is remembered as today. Pilecki began organizing almost immediately, inside exactly that environment, knowing that discovery meant the same execution wall waiting for anyone else who stepped out of line. Within the camp, he built what became known as the Union of Military Organization, ZOW, structured in small 5-man cells so that if any single cell was discovered by the Gestapo, it could not expose the rest of the network. Membership grew, quietly, cell by cell, until it numbered in the hundreds of prisoners, though the exact figure was never something anyone dared to write down. ZOW's purpose was threefold. First, survival, distributing extra food and clothing where they could be found, placing sympathetic prisoners into positions where they could protect others, keeping morale from collapsing entirely under conditions built to make men give up on being human. This meant, in practice, years of quiet, patient work done under constant threat of execution simply for being caught organizing at all. A prisoner, discovered helping another prisoner, could be shot on the spot, no trial, no explanation required, Pilecki built an organization that operated for 2.5 years inside that reality, without ZOW itself ever being fully uncovered by the camp's own security apparatus, an achievement historians still consider remarkable given how thoroughly the Gestapo worked to plant informants among the prisoner population. Second, information. From as early as October of 1940, barely a month after Pilecki's own arrival, ZOW began smuggling reports out of the camp, carried by prisoners who were released, by escapees, by anyone who had a chance of reaching the outside world and getting word to the Polish Resistance Command in Warsaw. Third, and most ambitious, preparation. Pilecki's long-term goal was to organize the prisoners inside Auschwitz to rise up and seize the camp themselves, coordinated with an external attack by the Home Army or an Allied airdrop of weapons, and free everyone inside at once. It was an enormous gamble, built on the assumption that if the outside world simply understood what was happening, it would act. Pilecki spent years testing that assumption from the inside of a death camp, at the cost of his own life if he was ever caught doing it. The intelligence operation is the part of this story that is hardest to overstate. The reports ZOW smuggled out, describing the camp's expansion, its selection process, and eventually the construction and use of gas chambers as the camp evolved into a center of mass murder, became one of the very first detailed accounts of what was happening inside Auschwitz to reach the outside world at all. The reports were specific in a way that made them almost impossible for anyone reading them to dismiss as rumor or exaggeration. They described the sterilization experiments being carried out on prisoners. They stated, with a precision that must have been physically difficult to write down, that the 3 crematoria then operating at the Birkenau section of the camp were capable of burning 8,000 bodies in a single day. These were not vague warnings about cruelty. They were an accounting. They traveled from the camp to the Polish resistance in Warsaw, and from Warsaw to the Polish government in exile in London, and through London toward the wider Allied intelligence community. For a period of the war, Pilecki's reports functioned as one of the principal sources the Allies had for understanding what Auschwitz actually was. Somewhere in the camp, prisoners even built a secret radio transmitter, assembled piece by smuggled piece over 7 months, capable of broadcasting camp conditions and arrival numbers directly, before the risk of discovery forced them to dismantle it. And here is the detail that makes all of it harder to sit with, not easier. Despite years of accurate, detailed, first-hand intelligence reaching London describing mass murder happening in real time, no rescue came. No airborne assault, no bombing of the rail lines, no coordinated uprising with outside support. The Home Army in Warsaw judged a direct assault on the camp logistically impossible, lacking the transport, weapons, and supply lines such an operation would require. The Soviet Red Army, fighting its own war a few hundred miles away, showed no interest in a joint effort to save Polish and Jewish prisoners inside a German camp. Pilecki had done exactly what he set out to do. He had gotten the truth out. The truth, it turned out, was not enough by itself to save anyone. By the spring of 1943, after 2.5 years inside the camp, Pilecki concluded that ZOW's original goal, an internal uprising with outside support, was never going to happen, and that his usefulness inside Auschwitz had run its course. He decided to escape and carry the full account of what he had seen out in person. On the night of April 26th into the 27th, 1943, Pilecki and 2 fellow prisoners were assigned to a night shift at a bakery that operated just outside the main camp fence, a detail with slightly looser supervision than most work assignments inside the wire. The 3 men forced open a metal door, overpowered a guard, and cut both the telephone line and the alarm wire before running out into open countryside in the middle of the night, with no certainty that the alarm hadn't already reached the next watchtower down the line. German soldiers fired after them as they fled, and Pilecki was hit, though the wound passed through without striking bone or any vital organ, and he kept moving anyway, because stopping was not a survivable option. The 3 men made their way on foot through Alwernia, then Tyniec, sleeping in the open and moving mostly at night, before finally reaching a safe house near the town of Bochnia. That farmhouse belonged, by a coincidence no one could have planned, to the actual Tomasz Serafiński, the real man whose stolen name Pilecki had carried on his forged papers into the camp nearly 3 years earlier. The two men, one real and one who had been living as him for years, met for the first time as Pilecki arrived at his door asking for shelter. He had escaped. He had survived nearly 3 years inside Auschwitz, organized hundreds of men into a resistance network under threat of execution at every turn, and smuggled out the first real intelligence the outside world had about what was happening there. He was free. Before he had even fully returned to open resistance work, while still hiding in the countryside near Novi Vishnich, he sat down and wrote out a raw, personal account of what he had witnessed inside the camp, in his own words, separate from the more formal report that would come later. He did not send it anywhere. He buried it. It would not be read by anyone else until decades after his death, a testimony a man wrote for no one but the historical record, on the chance that he might not live long enough to tell it any other way. He spent almost none of that freedom resting. Within months he had written out the full account of what he had witnessed, a document that would come to be known as Witold's Report, still hoping to convince the Home Army Command that a rescue of the camp was possible, that the men still inside could still be saved. It was not, and they could not. He was told again that the operation was beyond what the resistance could realistically attempt. Instead of resting on having survived the impossible, Pilecki joined a sabotage unit under yet another alias and threw himself straight back into the fight against the German occupation, a man who had just escaped a death camp, choosing, immediately, to keep fighting inside the same city the Gestapo controlled. When the Warsaw Uprising broke out in August of 1944, one of the largest single acts of armed resistance against Nazi occupation anywhere in Europe, Pilecki fought in it deliberately as a common soldier, not revealing his actual rank of cavalry captain until enough officers had been killed in the early fighting that his experience was needed at the front regardless. He ended the 63-day uprising commanding a company in the center of the city, in fighting so intense that the Germans would eventually raze large sections of Warsaw to the ground, in retaliation once it was crushed. When the uprising finally collapsed in October of 1944, Pilecki was captured along with the surviving fighters and sent to a German prisoner of war camp in Bavaria, where he remained until his liberation in April of 1945, in the war's final weeks, freed not by rescue, but simply by the collapse of the German war machine around him. Poland's most effective one-man intelligence operation against Nazi Germany had survived Auschwitz, survived an armed uprising, and survived a prisoner of war camp. He had, by any reasonable measure, already given his country everything a single soldier could give. What happened next is the part of this story that turns everything before it into something closer to a warning than a triumph. After his liberation, Pilecki joined the intelligence division of the Polish Second Corps, then serving under General Władysław Anders in Italy, the same Polish forces that had fought at Monte Cassino under Allied command. He could, at this point, have stayed there. The war in Europe was over. He had a wife and 2 children he had barely seen in years, and by any measure, he had already paid whatever debt a soldier could be asked to pay. But Poland itself, the country Pilecki had spent 5 years risking his life for, had not been liberated into freedom. It had been handed to a Soviet-backed communist government, and the men who had fought for Polish independence under the wartime government in exile were now, in the eyes of that new government, enemies of the state rather than veterans of it. In October of 1945, General Anders ordered Pilecki back into Poland itself, not to fight, but to quietly gather intelligence on conditions under the new communist regime and report back to the government in exile in London. Pilecki accepted, and by December of 1945 he was in Warsaw, rebuilding an intelligence network out of former comrades from his old wartime resistance organizations, working undercover as, among other things, a traveling jewelry salesman, gathering exactly the kind of information his new government would have called treason if it had known. Imagine what that year actually looked like from the inside. A man who had survived Auschwitz, escaped it, fought an uprising, and endured a prisoner of war camp, spending his days selling jewelry across a counter to ordinary Polish customers who had no idea who he was, then spending his evenings meeting former comrades in quiet rooms, collecting fragments of what the new regime was doing, and writing it all up for a government in London that a growing number of people in Warsaw were being taught to consider an enemy of the state. He had traded one occupier's uniform for another government's paperwork, and the danger, if anything, was harder to see coming because this one wore his own country's flag. They found out. In July of 1946, his cover was blown to the Ministry of Public Security, the communist regime's secret police. Anders ordered him to leave the country immediately. Pilecki refused, citing family obligations and the lack of anyone to take over the network he had built. For several more months, he kept working, kept gathering intelligence, inside a country that was actively hunting him. On May 8, 1947, he was arrested. What followed was not a battlefield and not a concentration camp. It was a prison run by his own government, and it was, by the accounts that survive, worse in its own way. Pilecki was tortured during interrogation and refused, under that torture, to give up the identities of the operatives still working in his network, protecting the same kind of people he had spent the entire war trying to protect. In March of 1948, he was put on trial, a show trial, one of thousands the communist government was staging against former Home Army soldiers and anyone connected to the wartime resistance that did not answer to Moscow. The charges included illegal border crossing, forged documents, illegal possession of weapons, espionage on behalf of the government in exile, and an alleged plot to assassinate communist security officials, a charge Pilecki denied outright. He admitted freely to passing intelligence to the Second Corps, arguing that as a serving officer, this was not a crime but his duty. It did not matter. This was not a courtroom built to weigh evidence. It was one of thousands of staged trials the communist government was running across Poland at the time, designed to produce a predetermined verdict against anyone connected to the wartime resistance that had answered to London instead of Moscow. On May 15, 1948, Pilecki was sentenced to death, along with 3 of his co-defendants. Survivors of Auschwitz who knew exactly what he had done inside that camp petitioned for clemency on his behalf. Among them was Poland's own prime minister at the time, Józef Cyrankiewicz, who had himself survived Auschwitz and had, in fact, been one of the prisoners who received intelligence support from Pilecki's own network inside the camp years earlier, a man who owed Pilecki something close to his life. Cyrankiewicz testified at the trial. He did not ask for mercy. He wrote instead that Pilecki should be treated harshly, as an enemy of the state, a sentence written by a man who had once depended on the prisoner now standing in front of him. On May 25, 1948, Witold Pilecki was executed at Mokotów prison in Warsaw, shot once in the back of the head. He was 47 years old, having passed his birthday less than 2 weeks earlier. His burial site was never recorded, and to this day it remains unknown. In 2012, archaeologists partially excavated the mass grave areas of Powązki Military Cemetery, searching specifically for his remains. They did not find them. For over 40 years, the man who smuggled the first detailed account of Auschwitz to the outside Allied world was, in his own country's official history, not a hero. He was a convicted traitor, and the government that executed him controlled every textbook, every public record, and every version of the story that Polish schoolchildren were allowed to learn. It was not until the collapse of communist rule in Poland at the end of the 1980s that his case was reopened at all. The Polish Supreme Court formally acquitted him of every charge from his 1948 trial. In 1995, he was awarded the Order of Polonia Restituta. In 2006, Poland's highest civilian honor, the Order of the White Eagle. In 2013, 65 years after his execution, he was posthumously promoted to the rank of colonel. None of it reached him. He had already been dead for decades by the time his own country admitted what it had done, and for most of those decades, the official version of Witold Pilecki was not a hero who tried to warn the world about Auschwitz. It was a traitor's name in a police file, quietly filed away by the same kind of government that had murdered him, in the hope that eventually no one would think to ask what had actually happened to him at all. It very nearly worked. What survived instead were the reports he wrote by hand inside a death camp, the account he buried in the dirt near Nowy Wiśnich rather than let it disappear with him, and the 2.5 years he spent choosing, over and over, day after day, to stay inside one of the worst places human beings have ever built, because he believed the truth of what was happening there was worth carrying out alive. It simply was not enough, in the end, to protect the man who carried it. Thank you for watching. If a story like this deserves to be remembered, hit like. It's the simplest way to help it reach the people who need to hear it. Subscribe if you want more of these forgotten stories, the ones that don't make it into the textbooks but should. I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you had family, from any country, on any side, who lived through this war, tell me about them in the comments. Those stories deserve to be heard too. Thank you. I'll see you in the next one.